Greg Bowling is a senior fellow and directs the Southeast Asia program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Greg, we really appreciate your time with us on our end of the year report to really give us some insight on Asia and specifically the South China Sea. So thanks for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. Happy to chat.
So let's just jump right into us. How likely is it, from your perspective, of there to be a maritime blockade of Taiwan? And what, if so, do you think could present as a trigger for such an action?
uh, it's a $1 million question, I guess, around town. I don't think it's particularly likely this year, or the year after. But, if we look out over a decade, I think that there's a not insignificant chance of Chinese military action against Taiwan, which could take a lot of forms. It could be a full-scale invasion, which perhaps the least likely but most escalatory. Somewhere in the middle would be a blockade, either a complete blockade or a blockade of key ports like Kaohsiung. And then third, that would worry me, would be Chinese military action against smaller, more vulnerable Taiwanese outposts like those in the South China Sea on Pratas Reef and Ituaba. And all of those are, on any given year, a low risk, but pretty high impact. So I think it's
Right.
irresponsible not to plan for those low likelihood but extremely high impact events.
It's interesting, when we look at the military piece, because that's really my next question for you is, and potentially, again, like you said, maybe not this year or next year, but do you think that there, is a likelihood of a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Is this something that the clock is just ticking, over the next 5 to 10 years for this to happen?
I'm not one who believes there's an actual clock, like Xi Jinping's got a date in his mind that if peaceful reunification hasn't happened by X, it's time to send the balloon up.
Hmm.
I don't think that that's what's happening, but I do think that the incentives for military action will grow over the next decade for two reasons. One, China will see, well, I guess for three reasons. So one, China will see what Xi Jinping calls the window of strategic opportunity closing, because of China's own economic slowdown, its demographic problems, the onboarding of long-term U.S. investments in next-generation military technologies in the 2030s. Right, China's edge in military capabilities is likely to be higher toward the end of the 2020s than it will be in the 2030s. And so as they go over that peak, there will be an incentive to go now while they still have advantages. Two, Xi Jinping's own age. He does clearly see the reunification of the country as China perceives it as a key political goal, and he will not live forever, nor will he be, capable of leading forever. And so I'm not going to look at his actuarial tables, but the older he gets, the more likely he is to make strategic blunders because he feels his own time is running out. And finally, the more time goes on, the more it'll become painfully obvious to China that there is no hope for peaceful reunification, that Taiwanese self-identity is moving farther and farther from China, and that China's own decisions in Hong Kong in particular have killed any legitimacy of the one state, two systems model.
Right. Well, let's shift to what our clients are really interested in, and that's when we talk about, the maritime industry and into commercial shipping. With that, how likely do you think it is that China would look to potentially impede the lawful and innocent passage of commercial shipping within the Taiwan Straits, in response to, an escalation really on either side?
I don't know that China would try to block all transit through the strait. I can certainly imagine China blockading entry and exit from key Taiwanese ports around Taipei and Kaohsiung. More likely is that in the case of a conflict, you will see seaborne trade choose of its own volition to
Right.
divert around potential combat zones. And even, if companies were not so inclined, their skyrocketing insurance premiums will ensure that they will be forced to divert around the strait. And the same is true in other waterways. If you imagine conflict in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, very large bodies of water, China wouldn't necessarily try to stop traffic, but insurance premiums would make the longer routes around Australia more cost effective.
Right. Well, that's one thing, obviously, with conflicts in other areas of the world. If something did happen, we would see, high risk areas posted by the maritime organizations here, or even, like you said, an increase in insurance through designating this as a JWC or Joint War Risk Committee, designated areas. So that could be prohibitive enough for, different shipping companies and maritime interests to say, hey, look, with escalation in this region, we're just not going to trade in and out of Taiwan, which could have a bigger, economic impact.
Right. And companies and governments, when they think about this, I think we need to be a little more sophisticated than oh, will there be a blockade of the Strait of Malacca? Will there be a blockade of the Taiwan Strait? What we really need to think about is, okay, there will not be a complete turn off of the spigot of trade in the Indo-Pacific in any of these
Right.
scenarios. But certain ports, certain countries, and therefore certain parts of whole supply chains will become no-go zones. In the case of a Taiwan blockade, obviously Taiwan, and the one that everybody's aware of there is, all right, semiconductors. What do you do if you lose access to the majority of the world's advanced semiconductor manufacturing because of a blockade or an invasion? In a South China Sea contingency, all right, you're not going to lose all traffic through the South China Sea. You are going to lose all traffic coming to and from Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. So what do you lose then? Well, if you're a Japanese automaker, you just lost your entire supply chain in Thailand. If you're
Mhm.
Samsung, you lose all of your modern handheld production in Vietnam because there's simply no way to get in or out without going through those waters.
Right, and it's a lot easier to be able to move when you look at semiconductors. You can theoretically still move a large amount of semiconductors in and out, of Taiwan on aircraft, but it's really difficult to move cars by air. You really need those sea lane access to be able to do that.
This is part of all of this. There's always going to be things that you could say, well, it's hypothetically possible, but does it become cost prohibitive? And this has to be part of the broader discussion that we're now seeing post-COVID of the move toward more resilient supply
Mhm.
chains, right? The I think global emphasis has clearly begun to shift away from just-in-time, cheapest possible delivery supply chains toward what level of cost is worthwhile in the name of greater resiliency. And that has to include not only political and public health crises, but also potential military crises.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about, you just touched on it a little bit, but let's talk a little bit broader on, the bigger South China Sea. Do you think could or would China, you think, ever seek to prevent access to the South China Sea in the event of escalation of hostilities? Kind of the similar question to the Taiwan Strait. Do you see that in, an escalation of hostilities potentially globally of this access being prevented in the wider part of the South China Sea?
No, I don't think China would, nor do I think China could. So, I mean, the vast majority of the traffic through the South China Sea is headed toward China,
Hmm.
Korea, Japan. And so it's hard to imagine a scenario in which either China or the United States would be pushed to such extremis that they would cut off their own seaborne trade or that of their closest allies. Even if you wanted to, it's a pretty vast body of water. The only way to realistically do it would be to close the key points of entry and exit, which
Right.
means the Bashi Channel in the north, which China may or may not be capable of doing, but more importantly, the Malacca Strait in the south, which China does not control, the US and allies and partners like Singapore would. And
Hmm.
then the Lombok and Sunda Straits, and to a lesser degree, the Cebutu Straits in the Philippines, none of which would be within China's power to easily close. And even if it did, or more likely, if traffic began to willingly divert around the South China Sea because of a conflict, you would find the costs of diversion much lower than people think. My colleagues in our China Power project did a study some years ago of this, and after the first couple of weeks, for most countries who are not Thailand or Vietnam, the cost of diversion, even if you have to go all the way around Australia, is not prohibitive.
Hmm.
It supply chains would adjust relatively quickly.
With any type of a blockade, though, to the first part of your answer to that, there would be an economic impact on China as well. So they would really look at, does this serve their long-term economic impacts to blockade, parts of the South China Sea or try to prohibit trade?
Yeah, look, the so-called Malacca dilemma, the idea that the U.S. or allies would close the Malacca Strait in order to choke off China's access to vital resources, particularly energy from the Middle East, still looms large in
Hmm.
the strategic thinking of some in Beijing and particularly in China's military circles, even if I don't think it's economic reality. But you have seen China make investments to avoid that, most especially its investments through the China-Myanmar economic corridor, of
Hmm.
which very little has been done, partially China's fault, partially the civil war in Myanmar's fault. But the one thing that has been done and continues to operate are the Shui gas pipelines that China built running from the Burmese port of Chokpu up to Yunnan. And that can, if at max capacity, account for something like 10% of China's annual oil consumption. So they've given themselves a tiny safety valve, but not one that can actually replace seaborne trade.
When we talk about, the vastness of the South China Sea, the Chinese island building that's taking place, do you think this could be a potential strategic impediment to the lawfulness of innocent passage for the commercial vessels?
So yes, now let's just to clarify terminology here. Innocent passage only applies in the territorial sea. So what we're talking
Right.
about is would China violate the lawful high seas transit of commercial traffic, not innocent passage, because vessels in the South China Sea tend to avoid innocent passage because they don't want to get close enough to any disputed islands to have to go into innocent passage.
Right.
To date, China has not harassed any commercial traffic through the South China Sea, but since 1996, China did close all of the Paracel Islands within illegal Strait baselines, declaring all of those waters that had previously been international waters, that still are legally international waters. China
Hmm.
declared them the internal waters of the PRC. They weren't heavily trafficked to begin with. There were a couple of routes between the island groups. Those routes are no longer used. You saw commercial traffic just choosing to obviously divert around because they don't want an international incident. So what you are likely to see in the coming years is China declare straight territorial baselines around the Spratly Islands, which would be a much larger group, illegally
Right.
close a vast chunk of those international waters as China's internal waters. And then again, there's not a lot of traffic that goes through most of the Spratlys. There's a very small number of safe routes, but you will see what traffic does go near the Spratlys begin to divert around because nobody's going to want to pick a fight with Beijing.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about oil and gas. One of the things that we've seen is that Chinese patrols near, oil and gas fields in the disputed China Sea have seemed to hit a new peak this past year. In your opinion, what do you think we can expect from that in 2023?
Yeah, this is the real rub. The issue of commercial traffic through the South China Sea is for the most part a red herring because you'd have to be in such an extreme circumstance to imagine threats to commercial traffic that it would probably be the least of our concerns. We'd be facing a wider regional war. What's actually happening day in and day out in the South China Sea, the actual violations of freedoms of the sea focus on the oil and gas industry and the fishing industry. So on the oil and gas front, what you've seen is China block or harass every single new oil and gas exploration activity anywhere within its nine dash line that encompasses 80% of the South China Sea. And it's done that for at least the last 5 years. So since 2018, not a single new drilling operation has taken place anywhere within the nine dash line without the China Coast Guard and China's professional maritime militia at least trying to block the effort. The results of this have been most extreme in the case of Vietnam and the Philippines. The Philippines has again given up on attempts to explore for oil and gas at Reed Bank, which is its most viable big gas find in the South China Sea. It called it off again last spring. Vietnam's offshore energy industry has all but collapsed. I mean, at this point, the only companies still operating are Zarubezhneft, which is the Russian state-owned company, and Exxon continues to tinker with whether or not it'll invest in a field up north. Zarubezhneft work is expanding existing field. The
Hmm.
new exploration that's taking place has been halted. Most of the Western majors have left. The Spanish Repsol sold out. The Japanese and Indians continue to sit on some blocks they're not actually going to explore. So this is pretty damaging for Vietnam. The only two countries who are still making progress are Malaysia, because Petronas, its state-owned oil company, can do what it wants and will do what it wants with the full backing of the Malaysian state, despite Chinese harassment, and the Indonesians, which were for the very first time in 2021 harassed by the China Coast Guard, which tried to stop a new drilling operation. And the Indonesians just last month, January of 2023, said that they're going to go forward with that operation anyway. We'll see how China responds.
So let's talk a little bit about that of joint patrols. We've seen the resumption of joint patrols of the South China Sea between the U.S. and the Philippines. What do you think this potentially signals?
Joint patrols are a weird word because it's not like we were doing joint patrols within 12 miles, the claimed territorial waters of these features before. So what joint patrols presumably means is just joint military exercises in the Philippine part of the South China Sea, in the
Right.
Philippine EEZ, which could be taken as provocative in Beijing. But then again, if an American sneezes in Asia, China sees it as proof of a containment strategy. So at this point, I don't really think the US or the Philippine government cares what China's reaction will be to joint military exercises. What is going to be worth watching is we've got new U.S. access to Philippine military bases through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which was first signed in 2014. That will probably lead to a larger U.S. footprint and support for a larger Philippine footprint in disputed waters, though not necessarily in like a joint sail-through way. And should China again attempt something like a blockade of Philippine forces on Philippine outposts, which they have done before,
Mhm.
it opens up the possibility of more direct U.S. support for the Philippines in helping to run those blockades.
So the last question that I have for you is, what do you think the international community can do to really safeguard the South China Sea region? Do we look at, carving out a delineated hard security role in the South China Sea? Are there other things that we can do? And I know you kind of touched on it a little bit before, but this is a pretty vast region when you talk about entry and exit points and choke points that are both controlled by China and the U.S. and its allies.
Well, first, the international community has to be clear and consistent in its messaging about its interests here, right? Nobody outside of the claimants has any interest in who owns which rock in the Spratly Islands or the Paracels, and that's always been very clear. What everybody does have an interest in is the rules. You cannot allow China to carve out waters 1,000 miles from its coast and say, we don't care what international law says, these are ours now, and you have to follow our rules. If that's allowed to stand, then how long before the Russians do the same in the Arctic, Iran in the Persian Gulf?
Mhm.
UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, will become a dead letter. It'll become a treaty that only applies to the weak and the landlocked.
Right.
And so the position of the US, Japan, Australia, India, the Europeans who continue to complain about this is about the rules, not the rocks and the islands. In that, recognizing that a successful strategy, to my mind, is a strategy of management, not resolution. There are no obvious resolutions here. As long as Xi Jinping is president of China, there will be no compromises from Beijing. And so it's about deterring aggression, which is largely the role of the United States in partnership with its ally, the Philippines, and then imposing some diplomatic and economic cost on Beijing for this bad behavior so that a future Chinese leader will hopefully decide that compromise serves China's global interests more than doubling down on this ridiculous maritime claim.
Right. So when we look at the perspective of our clients, the commercial shipping, cruise lines, large yachts, is there any other points that you think are important from, this region in a security perspective that we need to be focusing on, or that our clients we need to be looking at for this 2023 year?
Well, I would reiterate that the maritime disputes across the Indo-Pacific, and particularly those around the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea, they are going to remain risks, downside risks for anybody operating in the region for the foreseeable future. We should be realistic about those risks. It is not likely that China or anybody else would seek to directly block commercial transit through any of these waterways. But given the way that China has encouraged its forces to behave, not just its military, but its Coast Guard, its
Mhm.
militia, and other civilians, the possibility of accidental clashes that can escalate before anybody really realizes what's happening cannot be entirely discounted and do have to be worked into the resiliency plans of any company.
All right. Well, we really appreciate your time today. Thank you, for joining us, Greg. And we'll definitely potentially have you on future videos and vlogs that we do. Your expertise is invaluable, but this is an area that I know we closely continue to watch and update our clients on. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.